June 1942. A Coast Guard patrol boat is stuck off Provincetown, Massachusetts, pinned in ugly water while the storm tears the beach apart. Waves are breaking over the sandbar. The wind is screaming. Every ordinary rescue boat that tries to get near it is being shoved back like a toy. And then, from the beach, something impossible rolls into the Atlantic. Not a boat, a truck. 6 wheels, a steel hull. A canvas top snapping in the rain. A propeller churning beneath the rear like somebody had bolted a secret to the bottom of a delivery vehicle. The men watching from shore did not know what to call it. The Army paperwork called it DUKW. The soldiers would call it the Duck. The skeptics had another name for it. A mistake that could drown. But that mistake drove into the surf, reached the stranded Coast Guardsmen, and brought them back alive. 7 men walked out of a storm because a truck had learned to swim. And that is the paradox the history books almost bury. The same awkward machine that officers laughed at, the same ugly amphibious box that was not fast enough to be a boat and not normal enough to be a truck, would go on to become one of the quiet engines of Allied victory. More than 21,000 would be built. They would haul ammunition across beaches that had no ports. They would move medical supplies through surf, mud, shell craters, and flooded roads. They would keep the invasion alive when storms wrecked the harbors, and German demolition teams ruined the docks. They were not glamorous. They were not heavily armed. They were barely armored at all. But in the kind of war America was about to fight, the question was not only how to land on a beach. The question was how to keep moving after the beach. And that question began with a problem so simple that almost everyone underestimated it. How do you turn the ocean into a road? To understand why that mattered, you have to picture the old way armies came ashore. Ships anchored offshore. Small landing craft carried men to the beach. Cargo was lowered, pushed, dragged, dumped, lifted, stacked, and carried again. Every box of ammunition had to survive a chain of hands. Every fuel drum had to cross a strip of chaos between ship and sand. Every medical crate had to get from a floating world to a fighting world before somebody died waiting for it. The beach was not the finish line. It was a bottleneck, and bottlenecks kill armies. In 1941, the United States was staring at a war that would be fought across oceans. North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific. Islands, rivers, harbors, mudflats, tidal beaches, broken ports. Every future battlefield had the same hidden demand. Move weight from water to land without stopping. A boat could carry supplies through water, but once it hit the beach, it was done. A truck could drive inland, but if the pier was gone, if the harbor was mined, if the tide was wrong, that truck sat useless on the wrong side of the problem. The missing mile was killing the plan, before the plan had even been written. The men who tried to solve it were not Hollywood weapons designers. They were engineers, sailors, truckmen, and naval architects working under government pressure and wartime deadlines. General Motors had the truck base, the dependable 2.5-ton CCKW, the workhorse that American factories knew how to build in numbers. Sparkman and Stevens had the boat knowledge. Yacht designers, men who understood hulls, drag, buoyancy, and the treacherous way water punishes a bad shape. Rod Stevens Jr. helped shape the idea. Dennis Pulston brought deep water experience. Frank Spear worked the problem with the kind of practical obsession that turns a sketch into a machine. Their idea sounded almost childish when reduced to one sentence. Take a military truck and make it float. But the execution was anything but childish. They wrapped the truck in a watertight hull. They added a propeller and rudder. They fitted bilge pumps because every amphibious vehicle is, in the end, a bet against water. They built a drivetrain that could push wheels on land and drive a screw in the sea. And they added one of the most important details almost nobody remembers. The driver could change the tire pressure from inside the cab. Hard road, inflate. Soft sand, deflate. Mud, adjust again. The vehicle could change its feet while it moved through the world. That was not a gimmick. That was survival. Still, the first reaction was disbelief. Navy men looked at it and saw a bad boat. Army men looked at it and saw a bad truck. Procurement officers saw cost, risk, training, maintenance, and one more strange machine competing for factory space at the exact moment the country needed standardization. And to be fair, the skeptics had reasons. The DUKW was not graceful in the water. It moved like a bathtub with ambition. On land, it was big, awkward, and strange-looking. Its hull made it heavier than a normal truck. Its shape made mechanics grumble. Its steering felt different. Its body invited jokes. It was also unarmored. A rifle bullet in the wrong place could start a leak. A shell fragment could turn a supply run into a sinking. A careless driver could swamp it. An overloaded cargo deck could turn it sluggish and dangerous before anyone realized the sea had changed its mind. This was not a tank. It was not a landing craft. It was not a ship. It lived in the gap between categories. And institutions hate the gap. By early 1942, the DUKW was close to becoming a clever experiment. Nobody wanted badly enough to defend. Tests had shown promise, but promise is a fragile thing in a committee room. One report could praise its usefulness. The next could question its seaworthiness. One officer could see a breakthrough. Another could see a liability that would get men killed. The machine needed proof that did not sound like engineering theory. It needed the kind of proof that shuts a room down. It got that proof in a storm. Near Provincetown, an experimental DUKW was in the area for demonstration work when a Coast Guard boat became stranded in rough seas. The weather was not designed for testing. That was exactly why the moment mattered. A prepared test can be dismissed. A real emergency cannot. The DUKW rolled off the beach and entered the water. For a few seconds, it must have looked insane. A military truck pushing into Atlantic surf while trained seamen watched from shore and wondered whether they were about to witness a rescue or another disaster. The wheels disappeared. The hull lifted. The propeller bit. And the ugly thing kept going. Not beautifully. Not heroically. Not like the polished machines in recruiting posters. It fought the water in the practical, stubborn way of a machine built by people who did not care whether it looked ridiculous if it worked. It reached the stranded men. It took them aboard. It came back. When those 7 Coast Guardsmen stepped onto land, the argument changed. The DW was no longer a theory. It was a witness. And witnesses are harder to ignore than drawings. The opposition did not vanish overnight. But the machine had done something no memorandum could do. It had demonstrated its purpose in the exact kind of chaos it was supposed to survive. From that point forward, the DUK moved from curiosity to requirement. Production lines began to prepare. GMC and Chevrolet would build them by the thousands. By the end of the war, more than 21,000 DUKWs would come off American production lines. But mass production did not make the problem easy. It only made the stakes larger. Because now the Army had thousands of drivers who needed to learn that this vehicle was not a truck with a trick. It was a new kind of bridge. And bridges fail when men use them wrong. The training manuals could explain the controls. They could not easily teach instinct. A driver had to understand weight. He had to feel sand before the tires buried themselves. He had to know when the surf was hitting the hull wrong. He had to understand that a DUKW overloaded on land might still move, while the same load in rough water could become a death sentence. He had to remember that the machine was strong, but the sea was older. In camps and ports and training beaches, men learned to steer something that growled like a truck and behaved, at the wrong moment, like a boat with an opinion. They practiced driving down ramps. They practiced entering surf. They practiced shifting between wheel drive and water drive. They practiced unloading cargo where no dock existed. Some loved it, some distrusted it. Most respected it only after it scared them. That respect came quickly in Sicily. July 1943, Operation Husky opened the Allied invasion of Sicily, and suddenly every theory about amphibious supply had to work under fire, tide, darkness, confusion, and beach congestion. The Duck's job was not glamorous. It did not storm the high ground. It did not smash enemy armor. It did not appear in the heroic paintings that people hang in museums. It carried things: ammunition, rations, radio equipment, fuel cans, medical boxes. Men with wet boots and orders they could barely hear over the surf. That sounds small until you understand the arithmetic of invasion. A rifle company that runs out of ammunition is no longer a rifle company. A tank without fuel is a monument. A wounded man without evacuation becomes a number on a list. The Duck did not make the beach safe. It made the beach usable, and usable beaches win campaigns. In Sicily, commanders began to see what the machine really offered. It removed transfers. It collapsed steps. Cargo that once had to be moved from ship to boat, from boat to beach, from beach to truck, could now travel in one continuous movement. Water, sand, road, inland dump. The missing mile was getting shorter, but Sicily was not the final test. France would be. By the spring of 1944, every Allied planner understood the same brutal truth. The invasion of Normandy would not be won only by getting soldiers ashore on June 6th. That was the first miracle. The second miracle would be keeping them supplied on June 7th, June 8th, June 9th, and every day after that, while German forces tried to push them back into the sea. The Allies could not count on capturing a working port immediately. The Germans would destroy docks, cranes, warehouses, railheads, and roads before letting them be used. So the Allies built artificial harbors, mulberries, enormous floating systems meant to turn open beaches into supply ports. But the Channel had its own opinion. In June 1944, a violent storm struck the Normandy coast. Waves tore at the artificial harbors, smashed landing craft, scattered equipment, and turned careful planning into wreckage. For a few critical days, the invasion's supply line was exposed to the oldest enemy on Earth: weather. And this is where the Duck became more than useful. It became essential. The DUKWs could drive off landing ships, enter rough water, reach the beaches, climb onto sand, and continue inland with cargo still aboard. They could work when docks were missing. They could improvise around broken harbor plans. They could keep moving through the kind of mess that turns logistics officers pale. They were not invincible. Some sank. Some broke down. Some were overloaded by desperate men trying to push too much weight through too little time. Some crews died in water that gave no second chances. That truth matters. Because the Duck's legacy is not a fairy tale about a perfect machine. It is a story about an imperfect machine solving a problem so urgent that imperfect became indispensable. That is what war often does. It does not ask whether the tool is elegant. It asks whether the tool arrives. At Normandy, DUW crews worked in exhaustion. Salt water in their clothes, sand in the gears, engines hot, hands raw. Waves striking the hull hard enough to make drivers wonder if the next impact would be the one that found a weak seam. They hauled artillery shells. They hauled fuel. They hauled food. They hauled wounded men away from beaches that had become the center of the world. And the officers who had once mocked the idea of a swimming truck were now depending on that ugly little compromise to hold open the road from sea to army. The Germans had spent years building defenses to stop men and machines at the waterline. But the Duck attacked a different weakness. It attacked delay. Every minute cargo sat offshore was a minute the front line starved. Every hour a broken port remained unusable was an hour German reserves had to gather. Every transfer between ship, boat, beach, and truck was another chance for confusion, loss, fire, weather, or fear to slow the Allied advance. The DUKW did not defeat the German army by itself. No machine did. But it changed the rhythm of the fight. It made supply less fragile. It made beaches more elastic. It gave commanders a way to feed the battle while the battle was still chewing through the plan. And once the Allies broke out of Normandy, the need did not end. Rivers cut across Europe like defensive lines drawn by nature. The Seine, the Moselle, the Rhine. Each crossing meant more water between the soldier and the next objective. The duck kept appearing wherever land and water argued over who owned the road. By then, the men who drove them had developed a private kind of pride. Not the clean pride of parade ground vehicles. Something rougher. They knew their machine was ugly. They knew it was loud. They knew it could frighten a new driver and soak an old one to the bone. They also knew something else. When the road ended, everyone looked at them. There is a photograph that could explain the whole war if you stared at it long enough. Not a famous general, not a flag raising, not a tank crossing a field under perfect light. Just a DUKW on a ruined European waterfront, its wet tires shining, cargo piled high, soldiers working around it with the blank focus of men too tired to pose. That image contains the truth most war stories skip. Victory needs glory for the speeches, but it needs throughput for the morning. The next load, the next case, the next drum. The next wounded man moved before the column blocks the road. The next vehicle, arriving before the last one, has finished unloading. That is not cinematic. It is decisive. After the war, the duck did not disappear. It served in Korea. It entered foreign armies. It became a rescue vehicle. It became a civilian tour boat in places where families now climb aboard for photographs, laughing at the strange old vehicle that drives down a street and then into a river as if that were normal. In a way, that is the strangest ending of all. A machine born from the emergency of global war became a novelty ride for peacetime crowds. Children waved from the same kind of hull that once carried ammunition through surf. Tour guides cracked jokes in vehicles descended from a design that once made invasion logistics possible. History has a sense of humor, but it is not always gentle, because beneath the paint and the tourist seats is the same basic idea. A road does not have to stop where the water begins. The DUW also left behind a quieter technical legacy. The central tire inflation system, the practical logic of terrain adjustment from inside the cab, the idea that mobility is not one condition, but a conversation between vehicle and ground. All of that outlived the wartime machine. Modern military vehicles still care about the same lesson. Pressure matters. Contact matters. Terrain changes the truth. The vehicle that wins is not always the strongest one on paper. It is the one that adapts before it bogs down. That was the duck's secret. Not power, not armor, not beauty, adaptation. It could be a truck on the road, a boat in the surf, a cargo deck at the beach, an ambulance when the wounded needed out, a floating supply line when the harbor failed. It lived in the gap, and by living there, it made the gap smaller for everyone else. This is why the story matters. The DUKW was resisted because it did not fit a category. The Army wanted trucks, the Navy wanted boats. The engineers offered a machine that embarrassed both categories by proving the category was the problem. That is the institutional lesson buried inside the steel. New ideas often look ridiculous because they arrive before the language that explains them. Before the proof, they sound like compromise. After the proof, they are called obvious. But obvious is usually what people call an innovation after it has survived the laughter. The duck survived the laughter. It survived committees. It survived bad weather. It survived overloaded beaches, broken ports, and the punishing salt water that tries to turn every machine into rust. It carried its proof in cargo weight, not headlines. 5,000 pounds at a time. 24 soldiers at a time, one beach at a time, one missing mile at a time, and by the end, the awkward swimming truck had done what the skeptics could not imagine. It had changed the shape of movement, not by conquering the ocean, not by replacing ships, not by becoming a tank, but by doing the small impossible thing over and over until the impossible became procedure. A stranded boat in a storm. 7 men rescued. More than 21,000 machines built. Beaches supplied. Rivers crossed. Ports bypassed. Armies kept alive between the water and the road. The duck was never elegant. It was never the hero in the painting. It was a wet, loud, stubborn answer to a question no army could afford to ignore. What happens when the road ends before the war does? The duck kept driving. And for thousands of men waiting on the far side of the surf, that was the difference between an invasion that landed and an invasion that lived.